To order. Welcome to meeting number 7 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to continue our review of the Conflict of Interest Code for members. I would like to remind all participants that no screenshots or photos of your screen is permitted. And given the ongoing pandemic situation, all those attending the meeting in person should be adhering to the public health guidelines. There is no one who's joining us here for the first time, so I will not go into the details just to ensure we can maximize our time with our guests. I will ask that all comments and responses be made through the chair, and the more that happens, the less I will interrupt, and then we can maximize our time here together. We have our clerk, Mr. Charles Robert, as well as our law clerk, Mr. Philippe Dufresne, joining us today. And combined, you will have 10 minutes for your opening comments. So I will pass the floor now to you. Bienvenue au comité du PROC.
Je suis ici aujourd'hui en compagnie de Philippe Dufresne, légiste et conseiller parlementaire.
I'm here today accompanied by Philippe Dufresne, the law clerk and advisor, to respond to come and talk about the conflict of interest. The Chamber House has the exclusive right to regulate its own internal affairs. Closely related to this right and its authority to maintain the attendance and service of its members is the House's right to discipline its own members for misconduct. The conduct of members is regulated in part by the Conflict of Interest Code for members of the House of Commons, Appendix 1 to the Standing Order of the House. This code has been adopted by the House as an exercise of its exclusive right to govern its internal affairs, as I've already stated. As well, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner carries his functions within the institution of the House of Commons and enjoys the privileges and immunities of the House and its members when carrying out his duties under the Members' Code, the Parliament of Canada Act.
Under the Members' Code concludes that a member has deliberately contravened the conflict of interest obligations set down in the Code, the Commissioner may recommend appropriate sanctions. The member is then subject to the disciplinary powers of the House if the House chooses to take action. The House administration has reviewed the Code, and we have identified a few procedural and legal elements in it that could be examined and addressed by this committee as part of its comprehensive review. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Philippe Dufresne, who will walk the committee through the House administration's specific recommendations and observations.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs, membres du comité. En tant que
Thank you very much. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As law clerk and parliamentary counsel of the House of Commons, I'm pleased to be here today to answer any questions you may have. As the clerk has said, the House administration has reviewed the code and identified a few procedural and legal elements that could be examined and addressed by this committee as part of its review. First of all, Section 28 of the Code addresses the process regarding the treatment of a Commissioner's report following the completion of an inquiry in the House of Commons. It is understood that the elements in this section continue to apply, notwithstanding a prorogation or dissolution of Parliament, which can raise some questions regarding the timelines set out in the Code, in particular the right to make a statement within 10 sitting days of the tabling of an inquiry report, and the timeline of 30 sitting days to dispose of the Commissioner's report in the Chamber. The committee may want to consider whether these timelines should start anew in a new Parliament. This would provide a member who is the object of a report the opportunity to make a statement in the House to the members who will ultimately vote on the report, not those of the previous Parliament. Another issue is whether and how the provisions of the Code could be adjusted to deal with an inquiry report when the member involved is no longer a member at the time the report is considered in the House. For example, if the member has stepped down or has not been re-elected following a dissolution. We note that this issue is addressed in the Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons, sexual harassment between members.
to the House's debates on a Commissioner's inquiries report. The Code provides that in the case of a report that has found a contravention, The debate on the report is limited to 2 hours and that each member may only speak once for a maximum of 10 minutes. However, where a commissioner's inquiry report has found no breach of the code, there's no similar time limit, and the code does not address members' participation in the debate, which can have the perhaps unintended consequence of resulting in a longer debate. The committee may wish to look into this issue to assess whether there are good reasons to treat these types of reports differently in the chamber. Another issue that this committee may wish to look at is the effect of the House's concurrence in a Commission's inquiries report that contains recommendations. As set out in the code, the Commissioner may recommend appropriate sanctions in his inquiry report where he finds that a member contravened the code. The Commissioner may also include general recommendations regarding the code itself. To avoid the risk of ambiguity as to whether the Commissioner's recommendations in a report automatically become orders of the House following concurrence in a report, the committee may wish to examine whether provisions around the effects of the adoption of a Commissioner's report ought to be clarified. Enfin, les articles 31, 31.1 du Code pourraient donner l'impression.
Finally, sections 31 and 31.1 of the Code suggest that documents received by the Commissioner in the pursuit of his mandate under the Code, including as part of an inquiry, may be subject to production following a court order to that effect. As the mandate of the Commissioner is rooted in parliamentary privilege, and the Commissioner enjoys the same privileges of the House in carrying out his duty and functions under the Code, the Commissioner's documents would not be compellable by the courts, and this provision in the Code could raise questions as to whether the House intended to limit its privileges in this regard. Of note, the proceedings of a committee of the Board of Internal Economy examining the code of a member are exempted as parliamentary proceedings from disclosure to a court or other body and could not be used as evidence due to parliamentary privilege. The same should arguably apply to the Commissioner's proceedings. If the committee wishes to address this issue, it may wish to receive the Commissioner's perspective and relevant past experience.
In October 2018, the Commissioner published an advisory opinion on the provision of intern services to members by third parties free of charge. In his opinion, the Commissioner stated that interns provided to members free of charge by a third party, quote, are not volunteers under the Conflict of Interest Code because they receive a stipend or are paid by the organization that placed them. Therefore, the Commissioner found that such services constitute a benefit under the Code as service or property that is provided without charge or at less than its commercial value, other than a service provided by a volunteer. In sum, the Commissioner found that it was not acceptable for members to benefit from the services of interns provided to them free of charge by a third party if the organization placing the intern is registered to lobby the House, or the member has or may have official dealings with the organization placing the intern now or in the future. The Commissioner added that even if it is acceptable for members to accept the services of interns provided by third-party organizations free of charge, they are still required to report the benefit within 60 days after the start of the internship. At its meeting of December 6, 2018, the Board of Internal Economy considered the Commissioner's advisory opinion. In a letter to the Commissioner dated December 21, 2018, I indicated that, in my opinion, the provision of interns by the Parliamentary Internship Program is consistent with the Code in accordance with the Commissioner's advisory opinion, provided that the members using such interns are not likely to have official dealings with the organization and they report the service within 60 days after the start of the internship. I confirmed that the House of Commons will therefore continue to work with and support the Parliamentary Internship Program in its mandate. Given its review, the committee may wish to consider the issue of whether and to what extent the provision of interns to members of Parliament free of charge, as had existed prior to October 2018, ought to be permissible under the Code. Additionally, at his appearance before the committee last week, Commissioner Dion presented 6 recommendations for possible amendments to the Code. While we have no specific comment on the recommendation, we're happy to answer any questions on any implications that they may have for members. And thank you to the committee for the invitation, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those opening comments. I will just remind that within this chamber, the verification officer will turn on and off our mics, and anyone participating online will take care of their own mics. We will now enter into round 1, 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Barrett, followed by Mr. Turnbull, et puis Mr. Terrien, et puis Madame Blaney. 6 minutes on the topic of the review of the Conflict of Interest Code for members of Parliament. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and through you to our witnesses. My thanks for them appearing today to help us as we work on our review of the code. Through you, Madam Chair, Mr. Dufresne, you mentioned that you reviewed the recommendations made by the commissioner last week and didn't have specific recommendations. I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to also observe or review the transcript of our meeting, and there was a great deal of discussion on two items in particular that I'm just wondering if through the chair you could give us your interpretation or a recommendation. One is with respect to the definition of family. There was a great deal of discussion on the definition of family. If it's extending to first cousins, for example, nieces and nephews, we can see that the more the further you extrapolate, the more challenges that will present. In members being even wanting to comply with the spirit of the code, being unable to do so. But also, I think one of the members raised that their brother, they're not comfortable seeking their brother to disclose their financial dealings or personal interests, and by virtue of that, it would be hard to say that the dealings of their brother would impact their ability to do their job. So obviously more clarity is needed there, but certainly it needs to be clear. The other item that I'm wondering if you wanted to speak to, if you have a moment, is the question of the threshold. There was talk of a $30 threshold or a $50 threshold, $170 for a painting, or up to $200, whether it's acceptable or it is not. The context, gifts from people who lobby us, or having a ticket to an event, or food at a reception. So I think it's really important that we have robust rules that ensure the integrity of members and their ability to discharge their duty as parliamentarians. But we need to set members up for success. People who want to comply with the spirit of the rules and want to be transparent, but we don't just want to catch people out. I think that's important. So on the question of that threshold for gifts, but also on the question of family, be interested in your through the chair your advice to the committee based on our discussions to this point.
Sure, thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. On the issue, and I think overall, some of the comments, some of the remarks that we would make is that in considering any recommendation, any potential change, I think it's important to consider the role of the members, the nature of the role of members, and the implications and the impacts of any given increase in obligations and follow-ups that would be required. So what will it mean? Will it be practicable, and will it be justified in terms of the concern that it's meant to address? In terms of the definition of family members, the Commissioner indicated that the goal was, as I understand, in part, to harmonize with the definition that the Board of Internally has adopted. I think it's important to look at the purpose and the impact of the definition. The Board of Internal Economy, the bylaws of members, is dealing with different things, same as the Conflict of Interest Act dealing with ministers. So the board has adopted a broad definition of immediate family for the purpose of indicating with whom a member may not contract and who a member may not hire. So the obligation is on the member. In terms of the code, there are other obligations, as you indicate, in terms of disclosing the financial assets and so on. So a broad definition like that would have different impacts and broader impacts. I understand the Commissioner's recommendation, though, to be only with respect to furthering a person's interest. But if the committee decides to adopt it, it'd have to make sure that it's not expanding it for purposes that would go beyond the needs. And in terms of the gift, the gift rule, I think the weighing that you would do as a committee is establishing, is this justified? What kind of onus will this put on members in terms of assessing the value? Is it going to be manageable? Is it going to be resulting in an obligation that is so great that it is higher than needed?
Well, I appreciate the response very much, and I think that we have to take a look at that. in 2022 what the reality of some of what we face. I'm sure as costs have gone up, lots of talk about inflation. A visit to a reception by a lobbyist could trip you up, and whether or not a sandwich at a reception is something that is a reasonable person would deem unacceptable is certainly problematic. And the point with respect to the employment of family members, obviously that's something, if you didn't know someone was your sibling, there would need to be a reasonableness test applied to that, of course. But harmonizing those recommendations is important, and understanding that the Act, there is a higher threshold for ministers than there is and designated public office holders than there is for members. I think that distinction is important, but I appreciate your comments on that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. And now we will pass the floor to Mr. Turnbull, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today with us. It's a pleasure to hear from you, as always. So I have numerous questions, as always, but I want to start with one, which is Section 27 of the current code, which talks about requests for inquiry. I see a challenge here, and one of my concerns that's come up throughout the last Parliament and continues within this Parliament is that the conflict of interest code seems to be at least vulnerable to being used for political purposes from time to time. And, if you look at Section 1, it stipulates that a member can request an inquiry. That inquiry has to have some reasonable grounds for contravention of the code. And I think when you look at Section 2.1, or subsection 2.1, which is no public comment, it really stipulates that members that have filed for an inquiry or have made a complaint about another member cannot make public comment, but it's really only for until 14 days has elapsed. So, in fact, although the Ethics Commissioner needs to look at whether the complaint or inquiry is merited, whether it is reasonable, so this allows members of Parliament, if they so wish, to go out into the media and claim that they've made a complaint when there's no reasonable grounds that have been, to justify the complaint. So this opens up the code, I believe, to being used for political purposes, which is not the spirit of a conflict of interest code. That does not enhance public trust. And so I wondered, Mr. Dufresne, from you, whether you think that there could be some adjustments made there to prevent the code from being used for political purposes.
I don't have a specific recommendation on that point. I think that this is the balancing that the code needs to achieve, and that this committee needs to achieve and consider in terms of having a process that's accessible, having a process where there's no chilling effect on raising of issues, but at the same time understanding the context in which this is taking place with members of Parliament in a very public sphere with public reputations. And so what will be the impact of the mere filing of a complaint? Now, the code does provide that at the end of the day, there can be some filings in terms of whether a complaint is frivolous or vexatious. So there may be some remedy there in terms of findings at the end of the day. But that is the challenge in terms of whether and to what extent you will be limiting the ability of members to speak.
If I may, Madam Chair, just to follow up on that, Mr. Dufresne, I just want to ask you through the chair if this is regular practice within the law. So if you make an accusation of someone being in contravention of something or having broken the law in a legal case, you're not able to go out and, I assume that you're not able to amplify that message when you're in a court proceeding, when someone has not been convicted of a crime. So in this case, I guess I'm kind of thinking, how do we protect a person's reputation but from being wrongfully damaged based on a false complaint?
And there is often some public discussions about issues that are raised in court proceedings and the parties. There is this sub judice principle where one ought not to be arguing the case in public, but obviously there is a freedom of expression and the ability to speak. In terms of the question of what can be done by the code or by the House, or I think one way is outreach, and that was perhaps one of the commissioner's recommendations as well, but having a good understanding of what it means to have a complaint made, raised. It doesn't mean that it's substantiated. There's a process to look at it. So perhaps better understanding that the mere making of an allegation shouldn't be taken as establishing it, but rather that it's there and it will be treated, and when it's resolved, then you have the outcome.
Yeah, I guess, Madam Chair, what my concern is that members of Parliament can be essentially tried in the court of public opinion, and their reputations can be severely damaged for a wrongful claim, and that's made against them, and that's my concern. So, to me, increasing the threshold here to perhaps once a report is completed would be a lot more. Would help to protect against that kind of behavior. And we have seen some of that from my perspective. So would you say that would help, or are there other, ways in which we could tighten up that section of the code?
Well, the code, the committee can decide to recommend changes to the code that would go into that direction and would indicate the House's expectations of its members when they're making complaints.
Madam Chair. Mr. Robert, I thank you for being here with all your years of experience. I just wanted to ask you about the overall code in terms of its, I think, spirit. One of the things that I've studied ethics for many years, and I happen to think that perhaps members of Parliament don't always understand the guiding principles that are inherent within the code. And I wondered if you thought that the code was overly compliance-based, or maybe, like me, suspect that we could enhance the guiding principles of the code so as to hopefully build moral judgment among members of Parliament.
Thank you for asking it. Madam Chair, I would say really that the purpose of the code is, in some sense, largely reputational. You put this in place at the insistence, basically, of a public that is increasingly skeptical about the behavior of parliamentarians, and this is a way to, in some sense, respond to that. It is hard to be sure that you're going to be successful. A lot of it really depends, and in the question that you were asking to Mr. Dufresne, a lot of it really depends on voluntary compliance. These are meant to be guideposts to establish at least the minimum boundaries that you should observe to better ensure the overall reputation of Parliament itself, not just the individual members. And that's really, I think, the objective of this code. And to the success that your success will be measured really in your assessment of how, in general terms, the code responds to the public's expectations.
Thank you. Et maintenant, on va donner la parole à Monsieur.
And now we will give the floor to Mr. Terrien. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So I'd like to thank our two witnesses who are enriching our knowledge. When we spoke to the Ethics Commissioner, I found that there was a lot of murkiness in the picture when we had to evaluate whose family, who are our friends. And I'd said that you must be feeling much pressure to know how to assess whether these less clear areas will be clarified in a very concrete situation, so in how to operationalize the code. He answered that the pressure was not on him, but on the members of the House, saying that we have the responsibility to have an irreproachable work ethic. And I think all my colleagues here present know there's a lot of pressure on us so that we have to be sure that we do things appropriately. You were talking about internships earlier, for example. Well, possibly I could have an intern coming from a university where this is included in her courses. I would go and see the commissioner and say, this is the situation. Is this correct? Do you advise me to do this? Do you advise the members to check to make sure that we don't get caught and end up being in a situation that's uncomfortable? Would you advise a member to go and speak to the commissioner to make sure that everything is all right? Well, I think that's one of the commissioner's recommendations, who had said that if you're in a situation where you're of doubt, well, if you come and consult us and get a preliminary opinion, then that can cover you later, because first of all, you can say that you did consult, that you were aware of this, and secondly, you received the imprimatur of the commissioner. So I think that is good advice to say that if you're in doubt, you should do this. But there are maybe doubts that can be more systemic or chronic because of the code itself. Well, then maybe we should state we would like that to be clarified in the code so that the member does not have to go and get the clarifications one by one. And so when we talk about interns, should we recognize that an intern is not so much a benefit for the members, but more for the interns, and maybe that should be treated differently in the code? That was the issue raised. Is my sound all right? For these gray zones, I noted a few of them, and the preceding speakers spoke. Is my sound all right? Well, if you could put the microphone closer, bend the arm of your microphone. Can you hear me better? Yes. Okay. So I did note a few gray zones. There was the family, definition of the family, definition of friends, the activities that we are allowed to carry out, and the sources of gifts. I asked the Ethics Commissioner many questions about this, and I'm not sure I've understood about all these sources. So we're entitled to accept gifts worth less than $30, but sometimes the sum of the gifts can be greater than that if it comes from different donors, but it's the same source. I don't think it would happen to me. But if a member has a definition in their head, I think Mr. Barrett spoke about earlier, someone that I don't consider as being my friend, or someone who's in my family but I don't consider to be a member of my family, well, there we can have our reputation tarnished because we don't have in mind the same definition. And the Ethics Commissioner tells us that, well, we do consider that person to be in such a relationship with you. Has it already happened to you that the ambiguity of that definition has led to a member to be accused, to be found guilty, when it wasn't in bad faith? Maybe that would be a question that you should be asking the commissioner, to ask the commissioner if in the files that he's dealt with seen that kind of situation. I think in the code there are provisions that are more specific. For example, one cannot favor one's personal interests or those of a member of our family, but also one cannot favor in an undue way those of another person. So that concept of undue is more flexible and leaves more room to ambiguity. So if there are prescriptions that are very specific, such as family, you should make sure you're comfortable with the definition of family that will be used and that the members understand it. And also, there's this notion of undue where MPs have to use their ideas. So you consult the commissioner and say, well, it's fine for me, but just to be cautious, I'd like to know what you think. In terms of friends, would you think it was an idea that we should better define what a friend is in the code? The concept of friend in the Conflict of Interest Act is something that's defined for people who have exercised public functions, so ministers and others. It's not defined in the Act, actually, and it's done through the Commissioner's analyses according to the facts of the situation. So would you like that same thing to be stipulated in the context of the MP's work? Do you want to have that same level as ministers have, or given the role of MPs, it's sufficient to have a more general concept, so in an undue way promote the interests? So if you compare both, we can see that in the Act for the ministers, the requirement is higher. Thank you, Mr. Terrien. And we'll continue with Ms. Blaney for 6 minutes.
Madam Chair, I appreciate this opportunity, and through you would like to thank both of you for being here today and sharing this with us. And I think, you know, this is one of the things as parliamentarians I don't know that we spend enough time actually doing, is that public discussion about the way that we govern ourselves and the rules that are put into place and how they are followed, and how important those things are to our democracy. And I think I really appreciate what some have said about the idea of public trust, and how do we continue to use the structures that we have in place to engender public trust across the country. So that is always something that I'm very interested to talk about. So I guess I feel like it's a philosophical question in a sense, Madam Chair, but I guess I'm just looking at sort of some of the things that we're going through right now, and we have processes. Are those processes clear enough to the rest of Canadians? And is there ways that we could do better? And I know that there's two different parts. There's this internal part, and then there's the commissioner's part. But I know there's an intersection, and I'm just wondering if I could have that moment of conversation in the context of public trust. Madam Chair.
You want to?
I think really it's a question of how the outreach, perhaps, that Parliament could engage in to explain more clearly the boundaries, the ethical boundaries that guide you, and more openly explaining your role in terms of what you do as a representative of your riding, what you do as a representative of your political party. I think that explaining and how you in some sense expose yourself to the standards that have been put in place. Years ago, you would never have reported your expenses. Now you do, largely because you want to make sure that your electors and the general public can trust that you are spending the monies that are allocated to you for your parliamentary business. We are going through an incremental development whereby members seek to demonstrate more and more that the work they are doing is, in fact, fully in accord with ethical standards and representative standards. I think the more you do that, this engagement to have a review allows you to see where we are and how does that measure up to expectations.
Well, thank you for that. And I think one of the things that was said earlier, that some of these are voluntary compliance, some of them are structures put into place, and finding that sort of space in between. So I thank you so much for this presentation. This is not how my brain normally works, so apologize in advance if my questions are, I trust that the members here will clarify. But in one of the points, there's a talk about avoiding the risk of ambiguity, talking about the Commissioner's recommendations and the report automatically becoming orders of the House following a concurrence and report, and whether the provisions around the effect of the adoption of the Commissioner's report in the House ought to be clarified. So I'm really interested in that. Can you talk about what that ambiguity could be and what we could put forward as a recommendation that might clarify that ambiguity?
Thank you. And sorry.
It's hard.
So I think this is a situation where in a commissioner's inquiry, there'd be a recommendation that perhaps if there's been a breach, there may be individual recommendation in terms of an apology or a correction or whatnot. But there can also be, in the same report, recommendation that the code be amended because now we've identified an issue that is warranting of that. And so if the House is adopting that recommendation from the commissioner, that report, is the House in fact deciding to change the code? Is that something that should be done automatically by the House adopting the code, or should the House want to send it here for discussion? So it's really to clarify that. Is it as simple as saying you endorse the code and therefore whatever is in there becomes an order of the House, or are there procedural mechanisms that ought to be there? And to your earlier question, just want to point that the very first section in the code, the purpose, one of the first one is to maintain and enhance public confidence and trust in the integrity of members. So that's exactly what you're referring to, and absolutely outreach and information goes to that.
So thank you for that answer. So right now, I just want to clarify there isn't a clear process. So if a report comes from the commissioner and it has recommendations to change, what has happened in the past? Is it just sort of one of those things that slides by and nobody really attaches itself to anything, or does it actually have a process?
There's a process for that report to be debated and voted on and adopted, concurred in by the House. What we're raising is that concurrence always going to result in the full adoption of all the recommendations? What if the House wants to adopt some but not all? So we're just flagging that if the committee feels that that's something that would benefit from clarification, there may be procedural amendments that would just make that clear. If the House, if there are code changes, for example, should it be treated differently?
That's really good because it makes sense to me that actually we would do more study before that actually gets, okay. Thank you. I believe that's my time, Madam Chair. I really appreciate it.
You know your time very well. It's excellent.
I
Thank
time
you.
myself.
And before we enter round two, I am going to just a friendly reminder that comments are addressed through the chair, and as two great, strong people of the House, you know how that works. I'm here just to try to maintain some order like you do, but it's just a part-time gig. So I will say round two for me, for this committee, will be Mr. Viss, followed by Mr. Maloney, Mr. Terrien, Madame Blaney, Mr. Duncan, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Viss, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Mr. Robert and Mr. Dufresne for being here today. I have two specific questions. The first is in line with some of the previous questions about the spirit and application of the code. Mr. Robert, you mentioned earlier in your comments that we're incrementally looking at how we apply this code and how we conduct ourselves as public officials in our communities and what the public expects of us. Under the code, there's very strict provisions about reporting income below and above a $10,000 threshold. Are we going to a place under this code where, say, and this is a case that could come up quite regularly, say a member has passive income from investment properties exceeding $10,000. In the public's eye, the public may view that member in conflict of interest if they were to vote on any changes to laws related to the taxation of property, capital gains, or the appreciation of assets, et cetera, in compliance with the spirit of the code. Are we going to a place where members may be recusing themselves from certain votes in the House of Commons to be in compliance with the code? And I reference this point because it's actually a common practice at the municipal order of government in Canada. Thank you.
Through the chair.
Through you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, I think the issue might be better answered or supplemented by a comment by Mr. Dufresne, because in fact it's a legal question in the main. From my point of view, I would be tempted to say that looking at what they do at Westminster, you admit that you have maybe an interest, basically because of a prior career that you had before you were elected a member. You just simply say, I want everybody to know that I was formerly a head of a company or I was the head of a union of one kind or another, so they can at least understand the framework that might inspire your comments. But and this is where I think Mr. Dufresne would be more helpful, the idea of reporting your income streams is a private issue with you and the commissioner. It is not something that is, in fact, public knowledge.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so there are obligations in the code, as you indicated, as was indicated in terms of reporting sources of income, and that is with the commissioner. There is a publication of that information. Not, I don't believe that the specific amount is listed, but the general sources of income. And then the notion of voting on matters of general interest, general changes versus the private personal interest. And so there is that distinction, and in situations where it gets close, I think this is one where it'd be worthwhile to seeking advice and saying, well, am I here advancing my constituents' interests or general evolution of the law? Is this something where I can have so direct a benefit that it's a different type of situation? So if you get close to that line, it's a good idea to seek advice.
Thank you, Mr. Dufresne, and through you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chair, the spirit of my question again is, how does the public perceive us as members of Parliament? And so that's the basis behind that. I was very interested, Madam Chair, in the opening testimony of Mr. Dufresne when he referenced the parliamentary internship program. Let's address the elephant in the room. I'm a former parliamentary intern. I am the token Tory in the program, and I'm very proud to be so. It was one of the best experiences of my life. Now, it is a very unique program. It's the only legislated program in the House of Commons, run by the Canadian Political Science Association. But let's not forget, funded by some of the biggest organizations that lobby Parliament Hill. And I think that's a good thing. Because it gives young people well, I'm still young, but I was 12 years ago or so when I was in the program. It gave me one of the biggest steps up in my life. And when I heard the point B in the opening remarks that the member has or may have official dealings with the organization placing the intern now or in the future, I would be remiss if I didn't raise this point, because it almost seems as if I'm in some type of conflict of interest with the parliamentary internship program, given my past dealings with the Canadian Political Science Association, the Social Sciences and Humanities organization that funds part of the funding through the Political Science Association, and all of the requisite organizations that put funds into the pockets of interns. I would love some clarification on that, both for personal and existential reasons, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
We might have a headline out of this committee. If at any time members choose to go into camera, let me know. But I am going to pass the floor now over to Mr. Maloney, and perhaps we can get a comment on that after. Mr. Maloney, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you know, I'm not a regular member of this committee. I'm pleased to be here to discuss this very important topic. I only wish I had been here when the commissioner appeared before the committee on this issue. Through you, I have a number of questions. I'm glad. I want to thank both of our witnesses for being here today and for what they contribute to Parliament as a whole. And I'm glad that, Mr. Robert, you mentioned that Parliament has the exclusive right to regulate its own internal affairs, because in my view, many of these 6 recommendations are an overreach and intended to usurp that role. But I will leave that there. My focus of my questions is this. I view the office of the Integrity Commissioner as being there to help members of Parliament. Unfortunately, as Mr. Turnbull has suggested earlier, it has been weaponized politically. And we've seen that time and time again. And as you quite rightly point out, the purpose of the code is largely reputational. I want to address this protect versus prosecute. Do you agree with me, first of all, that the job of the Integrity Commissioner and that office is there to help members of Parliament?
Mr. Malone is asking me, I would say definitely yes.
Okay.
That's the reason why it was put in place, and that's why you're supporting it by this exercise.
Okay. And thank you. Now, let me ask you a question. Somebody mentioned, one of the members mentioned earlier that talked about when reports are tabled in the House of Commons, often commissioners' reports are, there may be a concurrence motion, for example. So let me give you a hypothetical. In a scenario where there is a report from the commissioner and he makes recommendations, say, to apologize to the House of Commons, and the individual who's the subject matter of the report does so, and then subsequent to that, the House of Commons overwhelmingly votes to reject that report, do you think there should be an obligation on the commissioner to then apologize to the member or respond to that in any way?
Through the chair.
Through the chair.
Through you, Madam Chair, I think that the Commissioner fulfills his functions under the auspices of the House, and this committee and ultimately the House have authority to make recommendations and requests, so it would be up to the House to decide what's appropriate in a given circumstance.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Would you agree with me that given the context, we're saying this is largely reputational, the absence of such a provision does have a negative reputational impact on members of Parliament in that scenario?
I think there is
Madam Chair.
I think there is the ability in the code to make certain findings about whether a given matter is frivolous. There is the ability in the code for the House to draw conclusions and make any changes that it wishes to make in terms of the code or its application. And so I would leave it at that, but the clerk might.
Okay.
The clerk would like to comment, if that's okay.
Of course, Madam Chair.
The operating assumption always has to be that the commissioner is acting in good faith. He did not, I assume that he or she would not have prompted the inquiry, that it would have been stimulated from an outside source, and there are obligations that the commissioner must fulfill in order to carry out the responsibilities assigned to that office. And that has to be borne in mind, even if in the end the findings are rejected by the House, and the findings could be rejected for all sorts of reasons that do not necessarily attach to the report itself. So that has to be borne in mind when issues like this are brought forward.
Okay, thank you. Good faith is very much forms the basis of this discussion.
Point of order, Madam Chair. There is major feedback.
I'm hearing it too, Madam Chair. Is that better? No.
Is there, we will check. Mr. Maloney, are you still hearing it?
I only hear it when I'm talking, although I'm not hearing it right now. So let me continue, and if it...
That would be great, just because we're running out of time.
Right, okay, so maybe this is my last question. Given good faith forms a big part of this discussion, and one of the recommendations is further education to be provided by the commissioner, here's a hypothetical. Do you think that if a member of Parliament were to say, for example, in answering questions on his initial disclosure statement, that he wasn't sure how to answer that question, and the response he received was, well, just answer it, do you think that's would be an example of good faith?
Last answer.
I think if one is not satisfied with the answer that one receives, then I would follow up with a request for more clarification, I suppose.
What if you did that multiple times and the answer continues?
So we have run out of time, unfortunately, Mr. Maloney, and we do look forward to you coming back and visiting us at PROC again. So thank you for being here with us today. Monsieur Terrien, vous avez 2 minutes et...
Mr. Terrien, you have 2.5 minutes. Yes, you're talking to me. Sorry. Yes. Madam Chair, there's feedback in the House debates with a report that concluded that there's conflict of interest. How many of these debates were there following a report that concluded there was conflict of interest? Unfortunately, Madam Chair, we don't have a quantitative detail. It's information that we could provide to the committee or do it through the commissioner. There were several, but I don't know the exact number. Would it be possible then, Madam Chair, to ask for that? Because I'll have many questions here. And if there's no positive answer from our witnesses, and I don't hold that against them at all, I could maybe give my questions and ask possibly for a written answer in a short time. Could I do this? Yes. So my questions, I'll just say them all one after another, and if the witnesses think I'm going too quickly, they should just slow me down. I don't think it would be complicated. One, how many times has it happened that a report that concluded that there was conflict of interest led to a debate in the House on the issue? If that's the case, what were the consequences applied? Were they the consequences that the Commissioner recommended? That's my second question. Is that fine for the witnesses? Yes. So you're very kind. Third question. How many times has it happened that a report that concluded that there was no conflict of interest led to a debate in the House? So a report stating that there is no conflict of interest. Then I'd like to check with the witnesses that in that case there's no limit of time for the discussion that will take place in the House. Is that right? That's right. And finally, were those debates, did they go on for more than 2 hours? If people really took the time to really look at the issue, to understand the reasons and the motives to say that it wasn't a conflict of interest. Is this okay with the witnesses? I'm sorry, I'm far away. Yes, it's all good. If there's a problem, I'll let you know. So if I'm saying nothing, it means there's no problem. You're very kind, Madam Chair. So I just would like to know, in the activities that we can undertake outside of the context of our work, is there some way, some guide? What would be the leitmotif that would allow us to say, yes, this activity is fine, or this activity is not acceptable, I should not do it? Is there something we can use to ask us to not go beyond that guideline? So we will ask for the answers. I'd like to know if you still are hearing the feedback, as Mr. Viss had. Could people give me a thumbs up on this screen if it's working? Yes, more or less. There still is feedback. So could you answer my last question? Yes, we'll get the answer now. Perfect. So, Madam Chair, in terms of the outside activities, what would be the guidelines of what can be done and what cannot be done? The code refers to a guiding principle. So to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest, to encourage trust in the system. And the rules of conduct, sections 8 to 10 of the code, to not speak about activities that could favor the MP's personal interest or his family's, or to favor in an undue way those of any other entity. So that's the spirit of the rule. In terms of occupying other jobs or functions, there's nothing there. There's unless people are parliamentary secretaries to ministers. So the commissioner has recommended that may be limited. It's up to you to determine if you want to do that or if you're comfortable with the general principle. Mr. Telliat, we have no time left, so I'd like to thank the witnesses who have come to speak. So we cannot accept gifts, but your words have been well received. Madam Blamey, 2.5 minutes.
Madam Chair, it's good that we're always generous with kind words. So I guess I have a couple more questions, and they're more around clarity. So there is a section of the report that we've received today, Madam Chair, that talks about how to deal with members who are no longer a member at the time of the report is considered. So I thought that was very interesting. And one of the statements in there is that this issue is addressed with the Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons sexual harassment between members. So it just seems interesting to me, if I just want to get clarity, that that is addressed in that piece, but in the other parts, it's not addressed at all.
That's right, Madam Chair. So in the Code of Conduct, in terms of conflict of interest, even if you're a former member, you can still have a report debated about you. If you were, the complaint was against you, and you can have a finding of the House as a former member, and that's happened. In terms of the Code of Conduct for sexual harassment, it's explicitly provided that if the respondent to a complaint is no longer a member, then the matter will stop. And so you won't have an order of the House about condemning a former member. So if you are still a member, yes, you're under the authority of the House, but if you're not, in the Code for Sexual Harassment, it will stop. So that's a question for this committee. Is this an approach that you want to adopt for conflict of interest? Or would you want to change the approach in the Code on Sexual Harassment and say we want to keep that, but certainly the more recent Sexual Harassment Code has said, former member, that will be off limits.
That's really interesting. And another question I have is around the debate. And so I just need this clarified. The code does not address, when you talk about the unintended consequence of resulting in a longer debate. Can you just clarify that for me? I would have had to read it more often to try to understand, but in what context does that happen, and where is the breakdown that we may need to look at?
Well, Madam Chair, what we found interesting is that in the code it specifically says in a situation where you have a complaint that was upheld, substantiated, you have a maximum of 2 hours for the debate, but otherwise you don't. So we wanted to raise the question, is there a policy reason why a rejected complaint should be debated for longer than a substantiated complaint? So we flagged that for your consideration.
Thank you so much. Mr. Duncan, to you.
Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today. I'll echo what many of the questions have been about the internships. I think this is something as a committee we need to address. I wasn't a member of any internship, but I started on the Hill as a staff member when I was 18 or 19 years old. But I know the value of these internship programs, and I think you said it really well when, yes, there could be a benefit to the member, but more importantly, and I don't think we can lose sight of, is the benefit to that intern of having that political experience and getting their foot in the door. So I look forward to continuing the conversation and trying to get to a reasonable grounds on that. And Mr. Viss made some very good points about the parliamentary internship program. We have those witnesses in and how that program is structured financially. I want to open a bit of a can of worms here, if I can, Mr. Dufresne, Madam Chair, through you, on something that was actually addressed, and I know this has been a conversation at different times in the commissioners raised this, around the ideas of letters of support. And where the line is. And right now, the analyst did a great job in the summaries of talking about this. I'll just read it quickly. Mr. Dion suggested that the committee could examine the issue of acceptability of letters of support. He indicated that many members have contacted to give advice or ask about it. Currently, the code makes no mention of letters of support. However, Section 9 states, a member shall not use his or her position as a member to influence a decision of another person so as to further the member's private interest or those of a member of his or her family, or to improperly further another person or entity's private interest. So I get asked very often, actually I think I'll put Mr. Barrett in the spot, I think he goes through the commissioner very often to ask on these letters of support. Where this asterisk or area that I think requires clarification, I would wonder your thoughts from a legal perspective, is on immigration cases or case files in our constituency office. I read that to say if somebody comes in and I've got a problem with CRA or my bank deposit or my child tax credit, we can go in and advocate and get that resolved. But I think of an immigration case of where a letter of support to say I vouch for this person X or Y, when I read the idea of improperly furthering another person's private interest, gaining Canadian citizenship or something along those lines, it's a very big gray area right now. So there's casework and then there's individual letters of support on certain individuals. Have you put any thought into that of where there may be a line or a legal aspect of where our casework starts and where advocacy or advancement of a private interest starts? And sorry if I opened a can of worms. That's the one that needs to be addressed.
I think what I would say is this is the way to look at the code and to identify these issues. So this is a situation where the code says you can't do if it's improper. So I think that's really the issue: is it proper or improper to do a certain thing as a member? And I think the more you're at the general level in terms of saying I'm advocating for the proper functioning of a department program, etc. I think the concern that the code is flagging is if it appears that you're favoring a given individual organization more than another, and there's no obvious reason for it. But if there's a concern about that specific issue in terms of doing it all the time, every single constituent that come, you will go and you will do that. Is that appropriate? And should it be clarified in the code to make it more explicit that it doesn't become a one-off every time?
I appreciate that. I think, and even as the follow-up to that, there may be, when we look at draft recommendations, of taking a look, perhaps recommending the commissioner give some better guidelines or more clear guidelines on that of casework. And I think the same thing as well, infrastructure projects. Mr. Garrett's, I both started at the municipal level, Mr. Barrett did as well, but we get asked, oh, can you support this community center funding or this road project we're submitting? And again, same thing, if we're saying, well, I think this project would be best for my community versus not providing one to another municipality, where's that line draw a little bit as well? So I don't have the answer on that today, but I do think it may be something for us to consider providing clarity, because as we look at the definition of family, you can concretely say, your second cousin twice removed counts or doesn't count. The issue of discussing, as I've mentioned before, of friends is where we get into that. So a supporter of ours that volunteered or took a lawn sign in our campaign suddenly comes into our office to say, hey, I happen to have my cousin or my family looking to hear, providing that letter starts to provide a gray area. And I just think the optics of it needs to be, it needs to be very clear of what is and what is not allowed in casework and some of those differentiations. I'll leave it at that.
Madam Chair, I think the issue that Mr. Duncan raises has a lot to do with how you define your role really as a member of Parliament. And the Code of Conduct is meant to guide you in terms of what might be seen to be acceptable from the public view behavior. But it should not really ever be seen as a vehicle that actually prevents you from doing your job, keeps you from doing why you wanted to be a member of Parliament. If it goes that far, then it's really crossed a line that actually neutralizes you in your capacity to actually function as a member. You have your duties in the Parliament and in the Chamber, in the committees, and in your caucus. But you also have significantly important duties with respect to your electors. And if you can't do the work for them, you may start asking yourself, well, why am I here? And so from that point of view, there has to be a dialogue with the commissioner so they fully and properly understand what is the nature of your work. I don't want to end my comments without acknowledging Mr. Viss, who I knew when I was on the other side and met him as a parliamentary intern.
And so I thank you for that. And you seem to be one of the few people who understand our roles as members for Parliament. So I thank you for those comments and for Mr. Duncan. Last round, we'll go to Mr. Fergus. A quick 5 minutes, please.
Madame la Présidente, j'aimerais céder la parole à
Madam Chair, I'd like to give Ms. May the floor. That's very kind of you. Ms. May.
Thank you, Chair, for welcoming me to this table, and particularly thank you, Greg, for giving me your time. I'm going to try to do this concisely. This is a real-life example. It's not a hypothetical, but I'll leave the name of the individual out. And I will say that I think we have a loophole in our code of conduct. I'll also say, like Ryan, someone who studied ethics, although in the context of studying for a theology degree, there's the concept of ethics as a high calling to moral conduct, an innate understanding of right and wrong. And then there's codes of conduct that I think lead us to looking at the black letter of a code and saying, well, that which isn't specifically prohibited is allowed, even if it offends a conscience. So here's the fact set. A sitting member of Parliament was hired by a U.S. corporation that was in the process of suing the government of Canada. As a sitting MP, he testified against our government in a secret section, a Chapter 11 NAFTA tribunal case, where it wasn't known that he was a witness until a couple years later when the NAFTA arbitration tribunal ruled that Canada lost, largely due to the evidence of this member of Parliament. The only arbitrator to vote against us losing was the Canadian law professor. Canada had to pay out $8 million. The MP in question never disclosed how much income he attained from doing this work. He was paid at his normal hourly rate for as much time as that took to do the work. That was, I estimate, at least $100,000, but we don't know. He remained a member of Parliament through all of this. I went, when he was re-elected, to the deputy clerk at the time to ask if he was entitled to take his oath of allegiance as a member of Parliament, because it occurred to me that testifying against the government of Canada violated the oath, and should he be allowed to take it a second time. That was viewed to be a non-factual complaint or whatever. I also then went to the Commissioner of Ethics. I didn't publicize that I'd filed a formal complaint, but I thought the facts here were offensive to the concept of serving your country and being a member of Parliament to accept private work from a U.S. corporation suing Canada. I think we have a big loophole. The Commissioner ruled that this was fine because his previous work as an MP, and he was continuing to be a member of the bar and able to do other work. I wondered when I saw the denouement in Palace of Westminster with various, though it was what was dealt with Boris Johnson was called the sleaze complaints, would those members of Parliament in the Palace of Westminster actually violate anything in our code of conduct to take private work for which they were paid? I'm wondering if you have any comment on this. Do we need to actually fix our code of conduct or be more rigorous in our oath as members of Parliament to be loyal to Canada only and not put your private interests ahead of Canada? Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I think the issue of work and paid work in terms of issues of conflict of interest is an issue that has been raised by the Commissioner. In fact, currently the code says activities outside Parliament, if you're not, unless you're a minister or a Parliament secretary, you can do those. Now, there is the broad general prohibition of improperly furthering another person's interest, so you'd have to capture it here. But the Commissioner did raise the issue of, is there paid work that, because you're remunerated and it's inconsistent or appears inconsistent with your duties as a member, should that be something that the code deals with more explicitly? So these would be the types of considerations that you may want to turn your minds to.
Well, I have some more time, amazingly enough. Does it strike you that it's clear to members of Parliament, regardless of whether we're parliamentary secretaries or ministers or opposition members of Parliament, in my case, do we not have to put the interests of Canada ahead of any personal interest as a matter of taking the oath as a member of Parliament?
I would assume so. But again, it depends on how you look at the code and how you read it.
Does the oath convey something higher than the code in terms of our conduct as members of Parliament? We swear an allegiance, or we solemnly affirm to be faithful and bear true allegiance. What our code says to our oath says to Her Majesty the Queen, but I think it's understood by members of Parliament. We're not specifically, we all love Queen Elizabeth II, but that's not the oath. It's to Canada.
both the oath and the code and the principles of the code really recognize the public trust and the public commitment and the public interest that members are there to support and promote.
Well, that brings us to time, and I thank you for that conversation. I would like to thank our visitors for coming and providing the insights. There are some questions that perhaps you didn't get to that if you'd like to comment, we would welcome you sharing that information with our committee. We're sure you'll be thinking about this invigorating conversation later on. So as you do, please take notes and share them with us. With that, have a good day. We will suspend as we get to our next session. Our visitors for joining us today. We have the Provincial Conflict of Interest Commissioners from Ontario, Quebec, and the Northwest Territories. And so what we're going to do is up to 5 minutes for your opening comments, and we'll just flow from one to the next So we'll start with Ontario, et puis Quebec, et puis the Northwest Territories. Donc, bienvenue et à vous la parole.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. In my opening statement, I'll provide you with a brief overview of certain features of the Members' Integrity Act, which is the Ontario legislation that sets out the ethical obligation for members of provincial parliament. I will also comment briefly on some of the issues this committee will be considering in its review of the Conflict of Interest Code. That said, I believe I can best assist you by allowing members to ask me questions and providing Ontario's experience on the topics that are of interest to the committee. First, I thought I should clarify that in Ontario, the Integrity Commissioner has the mandates and authority of 3 federal independent officers, including the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, the Commissioner of Lobbying, and the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner. I'm also the Ethics Executive for Minister's staff, as well as to the Secretary of the Cabinet. Having these multiple roles can be beneficial because it provides me with an understanding of the ethical issues that elected officials face, as well as the ability to address them in other ways. For example, not only can I advise a member under the Act whether he or she can accept an offered gift from a lobbyist, I can also advise a lobbyist not to offer that gift in the first place. In Ontario, the Members' Integrity Act lays out the conflict of interest rules for elected members, as well as their annual financial disclosure requirements. The Act also contains the requirements and restrictions for ministers. In many ways, the rules and requirements are similar to those federally, and the Act provides that members can seek my advice on their ethical obligations and any conflict of interest matters. The number of inquiries I receive each year averages in excess of 300, all of which are responded to in writing, so the member can rely on that advice. In the year following the 2018 provincial election in Ontario, I responded to more than 530 inquiries. This was due to the high number of new members that had been elected, all of whom attended a training session I conducted shortly after the election. I note that Commissioner Dion has recommended mandatory training for newly elected MPs. While Ontario does not have mandatory training, there is a long-standing history of commissioners addressing newly elected members following an election. I find this serves as a helpful introduction to the commissioner, the office, and the Act. However, we also have another requirement that serves as a form of training. Similar to the requirement in the Conflict of Interest Code, members of provincial parliament have an annual requirement to provide the commissioner with a private disclosure statement of their assets and liabilities, along with that of their spouses and any minor children. Along with this disclosure process, the Act requires that each member meet with the commissioner to discuss the statement and their obligations under the Act. Meeting individually with all 124 MPPs certainly takes time, but it allows me to ensure that their financial disclosure is in line with the requirements of the Act. It also provides me with the opportunity to discuss any conflict of interest situations they may be facing, or to remind them of specific rules under the Act. I view this annual activity as a form of refresher training for members about their obligations. And I emphasize I do this on a one-to-one basis. Of course, training can be effective in many different formats. but I will say that in my experience, the key to carrying out such activities is to build trust between the ethics office and the elected members. This ensures that members feel comfortable contacting the office when they need advice. I've reviewed the recommendations that Commissioner Dion has made for amending the code. While several of them are specific to the language of the code and the system in place for the House of Commons, I did want to touch on two of them as they relate to the Ontario experience. The first is recommendation number 4 regarding treating sponsored travel as a gift. This is the approach taken with Ontario's legislation, meaning that a member must seek my advice and determination on whether he or she can accept the offer of the trip.
Mr. Wake, I thank you for your comments, and we appreciate your written submission as well. But just to keep us on time, I apologize for the delay. Madame Mignolet, jusqu'aux 5 minutes pour vous maintenant.
Madame Mignolet, you have 5 minutes. Madam Chair and members of the committee and dear Commissioner, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to participate in this consultation. The exercise review you've recently begun is of great importance for democratic institutions if they're to stay relevant. As you requested, I'm here today to share my thoughts on how parliamentarians' questions regarding their obligations under the code can be addressed in a nonpartisan and independent manner, as well as how parliamentarians can reconcile their private interests with their public duties and functions. First of all, it seems clear to me that the independence of action of the person responsible for enforcing the Code of Conduct for elected officials goes hand in hand with the process for their appointment. In Quebec, the Ethics Commissioner is appointed by the National Assembly with the approval of 2/3 of its members. This allows the holder of the officer to exercise a public function in an independent and partial manner. However, the Commissioner's appointment is different from those of other appointees in that it must be proposed jointly by the Premier and the Leader of the official opposition after consulting with the leaders of the other parties represented in the Assembly. In making this choice, parliamentarians have recognized the singular and delicate nature of this unique office and the importance of appointing a person who has the confidence of all the members of the National Assembly. The independence and impartiality of such an institution as the Commissioner must also be reflected in the mechanisms provided to prevent real or apparent conflicts of interest and to deal with breaches of the ethical obligations of elected officials. By allowing the Commissioner to give advisory opinions to members, the Quebec Code encourages them to be proactive and transparent. In addition to being confidential, advisory opinions can only be requested by a member of the National Assembly directly involved in a given situation. This situation cannot be hypothetical. It must be based on concrete facts. These criteria undoubtedly help to protect this tool from attempts to exploit it. With respect to investigations, certain mechanisms also help support the Commissioner's independence in interpreting and applying the provisions of the Code. For example, when a member of the National Assembly requests an inquiry, it must be targeted and reasoned. The request must clearly set out the reasonable grounds for believing that another member has breached the Code, including a statement of the facts and the evidence available, if any. A member cannot ask the Commissioner to conduct blind audits to determine whether there are grounds for an inquiry. For inquiries that I initiate, I'm also bound by this reasonable grounds test. In a parliamentary system that now has fixed election dates, which suggests that the end of the cycle can sometimes be more intensely political, these criteria can serve as safeguards. Furthermore, while the Assembly, by virtue of its parliamentary privilege to discipline its members, reserves the right to impose a sanction following a report concluding that there has been a breach, the interpretation of the provisions of the Code of Ethics and Conduct of the members of the National Assembly is the exclusive responsibility of the Commissioner, who may also issue guidelines if he or she believes that it is appropriate. There is no easy answer to the question of how an elected official can reconcile their private interests with the exercise of their office. The difficulty lies in the fact that rules must apply to everyone, while their interpretation must inevitably take into account the context and facts of each situation. This means that in order to ensure a certain predictability of the applicable rules, there must be a balance in their assessment in light of a particular circumstance without proceeding solely on a case-by-case basis. Moreover, elected officials come from diverse backgrounds and the contexts in which they perform their duties change rapidly. This notion of necessary applicability therefore makes review exercises like the one you're conducting very timely. The National Assembly also wanted a parliamentary review in this regard. The Code provides that the Commissioner must report every 5 years on the carrying out of the Code and the advisability of amending it. But it is unrealistic to believe that these reviews can be held so frequently that the codes of ethics will always be able to respond appropriately to any situation, especially since they depend on a consensus among the parliamentary groups. I believe that office holders like me must have some leeway in applying rules of conduct so that they reflect the values of society as much as they are adhered to by the parliamentarians who must observe them. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
For Northwest Territories and the Yukon. Mr. Jones, up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the privilege of participating in this panel. As you just noted, by separate appointments, I am the Conflict of Interest Commissioner in Yukon, as well as the Integrity Commissioner of the Northwest Territories. The two are not connected. I just happen to hold both offices. In both cases, I'm an officer of the respective legislative assembly. Each assembly has 19 members, which makes my scale of operations enormously smaller than Mr. Waite's or Madame Mignolet's or yours. I live in Edmonton. I do not live in either territory, nor does the Integrity Commissioner of Nunavut live in Nunavut. We could not do so without ourselves undoubtedly being in conflict of interest just by our daily lives. I've been the Conflict of Interest Commissioner for Yukon since 2002, for 20 years, I realize. The Yukon legislation applies to members, ministers, employees in the cabinet and caucus offices, and deputy ministers. It came into force in May 1996. It has only occasionally been updated, notwithstanding various suggestions for doing so contained in my annual report. So they don't have the political will to do what your committee is doing and required to do to review their code. It obviously seems to be meeting their needs. Since July 2020, the Lobbyist Registration Act of Yukon has assigned certain functions to the commissioner. And I have to say, I have some concerns about adding on functions to the commissioner because the commissioner inherently is an officer of a legislative assembly, and a lot of the other functions are not necessarily of the same nature and kind and might not be privileged under parliamentary privilege. I've been the Northwest Territories Conflict of Interest Commissioner, title changed recently to Integrity Commissioner since 2014. The NWT legislation applies to members and ministers. By a separate appointment, I am the ethics counselor for deputy ministers, but it's a separate appointment. Amendments in 2019, so NWT has periodically reviewed its code, as you are doing. In 2019, the Assembly gave my office jurisdiction with respect to dealing with breaches of the member's code of conduct, which continues now from assembly to assembly. It doesn't die and have to be reenacted. It can be amended by future assemblies. And the provisions of the code go beyond strict financial conflicts of interest. The commissioner's role in dealing with complaints alleging breaches of the act, whether conflicts of interest or of the code, is as a gatekeeper to decide whether complaints should be dismissed on certain grounds or sent to a sole adjudicator for a formal inquiry and recommendation to the assembly. So if there is a complaint in NWT, I have a gatekeeping role, but I don't have a decision-making role on the ultimate merits of the complaint. I think the NWT and perhaps Nunavut are the only jurisdictions that separate those two functions. In 2021, last year, the Assembly accepted a report from the sole adjudicator and expelled a member and declared the seat vacant, and that seat was just filled by by-election on Tuesday of this week. I've also acted as legal counsel for a number of conflict of interest commissioners across the country. In my view, it's imperative that members recognize and live up to the standards which they themselves have put in place for themselves. In my experience in both jurisdictions, members overwhelmingly want to do this, and they're generally quick to seek advice in advance of what they do and to follow that advice. It is critical for all to recognize the importance of the applicable standards in order to maintain public confidence in the integrity of members. However, it is extremely important that unfounded allegations of conflict of interest, or even for that matter, founded ones, not become political weapons of choice. Politicizing the office is not helpful. And it's not just by other members, it's by the press or by the public. And with respect to some of the comments in your previous session, NWT has a set of guidelines for letters of support that members might write to on behalf of constituents or others. They're very clear that it does not prevent a member from doing their duties as a member, representing their constituents, but that is very helpful in my view. Yukon doesn't have similar guidelines.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jones, for those comments. We look forward to to hearing more from all of you. We're going to now start our first round of 6-minute questions. We'll start with Mr. Barrett, puis Mrs. Rominado, Mr. Terrien, Ms. Blaney. It will most likely be our only round, so please heads up that members might be asking questions that we would like you to get back to us on, and we would appreciate any insights that you would share.
To Mr. Duncan, Madam Chair.
To Mr. Duncan.
Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here and your insights into your respective jurisdictions. In the interest of time, I think it would be good for us to have in writing perhaps some more of these detailed responses, but there are 5 areas which I'll try to get through in 6 minutes. In any of your 3 jurisdictions, some of the topics that I think we've had a lot of questions or commentary on are externally paid interns. In your respective jurisdictions, do you have any sets of rules for members accepting the services of externally paid interns? And I'll start with Mr. Wake.
Through the chair.
Well, through the chair, Mr. Duncan, there is a legislative intern program where legislative interns are assigned to members. I speak to them every year. They come to my office, but I have no involvement with them beyond that.
I'll go through Mr. Jones yourself in your jurisdictions.
There aren't any legislative interns
No.
in either Yukon or NWT.
Madame Mignolet.
Madame Mignolet? Yes. So we do have interns whose internship seems to fall in the situation that you're saying. So the Bon Enfant interns, in terms of the funding of those internships, all I know is that it's done through a foundation, that it doesn't raise any issues for us on our side.
The 3 witnesses here in your experience, I'll just ask perhaps that you could provide in writing and our clerk or analyst could follow up with your offices on a couple of other things in topics we've been talking about. One of them being the endorsement of other elected officials at other levels of government. Do you have rules or protocols regarding, for an example, a provincial member endorsing a municipal candidate? If there's that, or if there are rules around the use of resources and your titles around that, that would be appreciated. Another thing that would be helpful, I believe, in our deliberations would be around when your office starts to get involved of the acceptance and price points of gifts. So not only the acceptability of a gift, but the public disclosure of that. Do you have a minimum limit at which members would go for declaring or asking if a gift is appropriate or not? Not only from a public disclosure, but at what point they should consult on the acceptability. That would be appreciated to have your written comments on that. And another thing to ask is the definition of friends, which we've been struggling with. I would be interested in knowing what your definitions of family are in your respective jurisdictions, but we're struggling with the concept of friends. And I joke that I have a lot of friends, I feel, and a lot of people that think they're my friends. And I'm struggling with the government benches are not agreeing right now with my population of friends. But it would be, do you have any definition of friends? Have you considered it? And if you have or have not, perhaps some reasoning or experience you would have on that. And then lastly, Madam Chair, through you, is any information you could provide on letters of support for individual applications to government agencies, individual constituents' request for a service from the government? If you have any advice and experience on that topic, I think that would certainly guide us in our deliberations of the report. Madam Chair, in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. He does have a minute left. Mr. Wake, would you like to comment real quickly?
Real quickly, going back to the legislative intern program, the one in Ontario is excellent. In fact, I've hired 2 of the legislative intern to my office to perform various functions. Yes, I have information I can give you on all of the topics you've just outlined. We have guidelines for letters of support, and in terms of friends, no, I think that's a particularly problematic area to be introduced into the legislation. We refer to another person and let it go at that.
Thank you.
I think
we look forward to sharing them. Madame Mignolet?
Thank you. So I will also be happy to answer these questions in writing. We also have lines concerning letters of support, and as in Ontario, we don't have a definition of friends. It's just other people, other persons, and I would be happy to discuss that. And also of the issue of accepting gifts, we'll send you that information.
Mr. Jones, would you like to comment quickly?
Yes. Both Yukon and NWT have a dollar limit for acceptable gifts, and they must be publicly disclosed. And secondly, neither legislation has a definition of friends, and there are issues, and they're difficult issues, about improperly forwarding the interests of a private person. What is improper?
Thank you so much. Now 6 minutes to Mrs. Romanato.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Merci beaucoup aux témoins.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the witnesses for your evidence today.
Previous panel with respect to politicizing complaints. And in our code, we have stipulated that a member who requests that an inquiry be conducted shall make no public comments relating to the inquiry until the commissioner confirms that the member who is the subject of the inquiry has received a copy of the complaint or 14 days have elapsed following the receipt. What are your thoughts with respect to the politicization of conflict of interest inquiries, whereas an MP can put forward an accusation or a request for an inquiry? It could be completely unfounded, but as you know, the job that we do is very much in the public domain, that this could be spread with respect to social media, and then the reputation of the member can be tarnished. Would you recommend that that provision be removed from our code?
To Mr. Jones, through the chair.
Thank you, sorry.
No, I'd recommend it be strengthened, and that there be a prohibition against discussing it in the interim before the commissioner is able to deal with it. Several commissioners across the country have expressed dismay at the complainant going to the press immediately, often before the commissioner themselves have received the complaint. But the politicization of by the member being complained against, and the example that I'm particularly thinking of, by their counsel having press conferences and press conferences and press conferences, and including their responses to the complaint at a time when I can't say anything about it because it's still under investigation. That does not help the process. So I think a strengthening of the prohibition would be, in fact, helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Madame Mignolet, avez-vous un commentaire sur le même?
Madame Millionnet, do you have any comments on this issue? Thank you. Well, here we have nothing in our code that prevents an elected official to speak about the request for an inquiry that he would have presented to the commissioner, and there's also no deadline for the commissioner analyzing a request. You have that 15 days, and I have recommended that this be the case with us. And I think that that is a good provision to wait until the commissioner has decided that to launch an investigation before being able to talk about it.
MP Turnbull.
Thank you, Ms. Romanato, and Madam Chair, through you to Mr. Jones. You'd spoken in your comments about the separation between the complaint function or the looking at whether a complaint is actually merited or justified, and the function which is to investigate and make decisions or sort of adjudicate that complaint. Could you speak to the merits of that separation for us? Because I think that relating back to Ms. Romanato's comments and my earlier comments in our previous panel, I think would be very helpful for us.
True, Madam Chair. I think there actually are three distinct areas. One is the advisory function of the commissioner. I give advice on a quite regular basis to members who are concerned about whether to be on the right side of things and consult me before they do something. An ounce of prevention's worth a ton of cure. And so that is one function. A separate function is receiving and investigating complaints. Most commissioners across the country, and I in Yukon, have the ability, if I receive a complaint, that I then investigate it. And that may cause some difficulties in vis-a-vis the advisory function, which is private and confidential unless the member discloses it or says that they've consulted me. Quebec has a different system of providing a separate advisor. And then there's the inquiry function, which I have in Yukon. I don't have an NWT of separating the inquiry after I find the gate is open, that there is something there, a preliminary matter. The difficulty with that, Yukon has found, is that it's quite expensive and it takes time. Now, it provides a further independent look at it, but is NWT's recent experience is the inquiry, not me, the inquiry cost over $800,000.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I appreciate that. And to Mr. Wake, I'm going to go to you now. In terms of publishing guidelines, you'd spoken to mandatory training and that wasn't required in Ontario, but that you traditionally meet with new members, and they are kind of required to meet with you upon annual disclosures. Just wondering whether you have the ability, and perhaps this could be a question that all the panelists could quickly answer with one word. Are you able to, do you have the power to publish guidelines for your members within the legislatures?
Mr. Wake?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. Yes, I do. It's not specified in the Act, so I take it from that I'm not prohibited from publishing guidelines. And the guidelines I have published on all of the topics, gifts, letters of support, I've published these as guidelines. They're on our website, and members have frequently commented to me, and their staff have commented to me on how helpful they are.
Madame Mignolet?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, yes, I do have the authority to publish guidelines on the topics that I consider to be relevant, because maybe I've had a lot of questions on those issues. So, and that's explicitly stated in the law. Thank you. Mr. Jones?
Mr. Jones?
Madam Chair, in neither the Yukon legislation nor the NWT legislation is there a specific reference to guidelines, but there's not a specific prohibition. So I'd be in the same situation as Mr. Wake. And I would point out that that Ontario and Alberta and BC have very extensive guidelines, which I refer the members to because they're very helpful.
Thank you. Et maintenant la parole à Monsieur Terrien.
Now, Mr. Terrien has the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to say hello to Mr. Waite, Mr. Jones, and especially Madame Mignolet, who I was close to at the National Assembly. First question for you, Madame Mignolet. In terms of what you said at the beginning of your intervention, I would have liked to have you go a bit further. This situation cannot be hypothetical. It must be based on concrete facts. These criteria continue to prevent the tool from being exploited or instrumentalized. What do you mean by exploitation or instrumentalization? So, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I think that the process put in place in the code for consultation, so in terms of prevention, the goal is that these advisory opinions are confidential, and one cannot request an advisory opinion on a situation that doesn't concern one directly, and nothing purely hypothetical. The goal is that we give an opinion on a real situation. We're there to prevent conflicts of interest, to help in the reflection, and help the member adopt conduct that's appropriate in the circumstances. We certainly do not want the commissioner called because we're wondering how an adverse party could behave. We hear that someone has a certain issue and then we want to talk about it in the media. That's completely unacceptable. Now, I have a question for Mr. Jones. I was surprised to hear you say that, well, you do work for the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, but you live in Edmonton in order to avoid that your personal life places you in a situation of conflict of interest. And I don't know where Mr. Wake lives. I know that Madame Mignolet, I imagine she lives near the National Assembly. And you're telling us that it avoids conflict of interest to not live in the place where you make the decisions related to conflicts of interest. I'd like to hear you on that topic. I was surprised. Yes, through to the chair. Mr. Jones?
Madam Chair, you have to remember that the population of Yukon is about 30,000 people, the majority of whom live in Whitehorse. If I lived in Whitehorse, my daily life would undoubtedly take me into contact with people who are members of the Legislative Assembly or who have complaints. And similarly in NWT, a population about the same, slightly more, and similar situation with Yellowknife. And the commissioners of Yukon have never lived in the territory while they were commissioner. The commissioners of NWT have almost, but not always, lived elsewhere. It simply is an ability, it prevents my being conflicted out or be perceived to be just because of my daily life. You know, I go to this church or I do that or whatever else. So, but in Ontario, it's a big jurisdiction. Canada's a big jurisdiction. Ottawa's a big city, and so on.
Je dois vous dire, Madame la...
I must say, Madam Chair, that I'm very satisfied with the answer. You know, it seemed curious, and he answered very clearly. I understand now why he is in that situation. I would like to thank him. It really wasn't a malicious question. It was just a question that was there, and now I've understood very clearly. Thank you, Mr. Jones. That's very kind. I have a final question, and I would like to ask each of you to give their opinion on what is family. The Ethics Commissioner has decided to broaden that because initially the family for him was very limited, and then it was decided to expand that considerably. So I would like to know what your definition is of the family and what your opinion on this expansion of the concept of family. Madame Mignolet? Thank you. So in Quebec, the family, the immediate family, is defined. It's the spouse, the children of the children of the spouse, and with the code, that's not a problem because the section that says that one cannot unduly favor someone or members of one's family has the mention of the family and the children who are not one's dependents, so that's broadened. So then the expanded family is in the category of other people. So the criterion is to further the interests of another person in an abusive way. So we do take into account the criterion of proximity. Thank you very much. Mr. Jones.
Mr. Jones?
Yes, sorry, just had to unmute. In both my territories, there's a definition of family which is limited to the nuclear family, including adopted children, but with dependent children. And so one of the challenges is when children become 24, 25, 30, they're not family, but they might fall into the other broader categories of the code.
Mr. Wake?
Yes, through Madam Chair, the definition in the Members' Integrity Act is of family is the nuclear family, the spouse and minor children, and any other adult who is related to the person or his or her spouse, shares a residence with the person, and is primarily dependent on the person or spouse for financial support. That's the limit.
Thank you so much. Merci, Mr. Terrien. Et maintenant, pour 6 minutes, la parole à Madame Blaney.
Thank you, Mr. Terrien. And now 6 minutes, Madame Blaney.
And I'd like to thank all of the witnesses through you today for their interesting presentations. My first question is just around, there was some discussion earlier about recommendations and guidelines based on previous investigations or reflections. And I'm just wondering, at the beginning of each of your parliaments or legislatures, does it get deleted? And is there a restart? So what I guess I'm trying to ask is, when you make a guideline or something, does that continuously stay on, or do you have to dismiss that and start again after every election? And I'm asking all the members, Madam Chair.
So we'll start with Mr. Wake.
Through you, Madam Chair. The simple answer is no. They continue. They're not affected by by an election or the change until they get changed.
I apologize for tech issues. I can tell some people are having feedback. Mr. Jones.
No, the guidelines are constantly speaking, but as I mentioned earlier, the code of conduct in NWT has just been changed, or the legislative provision has just been changed to make it constantly speaking as well. Before, it had to be renewed by each parliament. Not so anymore, but the guidelines will be constantly speaking.
Thank you. Madame Mignolet?
Oui.
Yes, so for us, the guidelines stay in existence until we choose that it's to modify them, to amend them, or decide that it is.
I'm respecting that rule, and so that does mean I will pause. So thank you, Madam Chair, for checking that out with me, and I appreciate the folks that push the button that allows me to speak. I guess my next question is just around outside work and remuneration. You know, there is some concern that when a member of Parliament in this case, but a member of the different systems, provincially and territorial, have outside work that they can have an impact. I'm just wondering if you could, through you, Madam Chair, share with us any sort of guidelines that you may or may not have, and give us feedback on if there's particular work that would be concerning versus other types of work. And I guess the last part of that question is there any consideration to work that you may have done previously to being elected as opposed to getting a new position or work after you are elected?
Mr. Wake?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. There's no jurisdiction to deal with a situation after someone has left their elected office. And with respect to work that they may have done beforehand, it may present itself in the form of a conflict in terms of relationships people have had, and whether somebody is lobbying them for something. There's a whole wide spectrum of things that could come as a result of prior employment. But as I understand the recommendations, it's with respect to people not being able to work while they are an elected member of Parliament. We don't have that restriction in Ontario. It may come out in certain, if somebody is working at something that may place them in a conflict, we'll deal with that on a case-by-case basis. But there is nothing to prevent a member from holding another occupation other than a cabinet minister. Parliamentary assistants in Ontario are not in the same situation as cabinet ministers. They can hold outside employment as well. Very few do, but it's in the act.
Mr. Jones?
In both the Yukon and NWT, members are allowed to have outside interests, but ministers may not. Subject, however, to some discretion in NWT and the commissioner to allow certain things, and usually that's done for nonprofit things and so on. The previous work might create a need to insulate the member or the minister from certain things that they would otherwise do, because it might create a reasonable apprehension of a conflict. And in NWT, and in Yukon, there are provisions of preventing former members from doing certain things for certain periods of time.
Thank you. Madame Mignolet?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Quebec, we do have provisions in the code that talk about functions. So a member of the executive cannot carry out other functions, but the MP can, the member of the MLA rather. And so there are clear things that can be done. So there are safeguards with definitions. It's more flexible in the field of education and health. I can give you more in writing if you want to know more about it, because this could be long. In terms of a previous occupation, there may be cases where some past employment requires that measures of protection be put in so that conflicts of interests are prevented, so it can make the exercise of one's duties a bit more complex, but we are there to help the MLAs for that.
Obviously, you are also interested in this area, so any insights you would like to provide in writing, we would welcome that. But I do, on behalf of all committee members, want to say thank you for taking the time to join us today. It means a lot to us. And if anything else comes up that you would like us to know, please do not hesitate to write to us. So with that, we hope you and your loved ones keep well and safe. And to all committee members, we'll see you in the House or around. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.